Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today's episode. I'm really excited to announce strategy expert Alex Smith as our guest for today's episode. I've been through his book 3 times now, which isn't that much if you know it's only about 140 pages long. But I keep finding new insights and perspectives I haven't had before. But enough for the intro, let's go into the content. Hey Alex, thank you so much for showing up today. I'm really glad having you here.
Oh, happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
I've been reading your book and enjoying your book so many times. I've been listening to it and I've been reading it back to forth. With my other guests, we're always talking about agile transitions and roles and responsibilities, but most of the time we lack a certain part that has a strategic side to it. Like when we talk about agile, it's very much on the execution side, and then we have the product side. But above that, we end up at questions regarding strategy. And I certainly have never seen anything like your book out there in strategy, and I really enjoyed reading it. So it would be super cool if you could give us a heads up on what strategy is on your side and a brief introduction of who you are.
Sure. So, yeah, I suppose at the end of the day, just a strategy consultant, which isn't a great thing to say at a dinner party. But, I wrote the book because I've been working in particular with sort of younger kind of founders of businesses that are, not sort of, Fortune 500 businesses. And what you find is that I think that there probably is some quite good strategy understanding if you go into the boardrooms of like Shell or a company like that, where there's a whole bunch of MBAs, and I think they more or less know what they're doing. When you drop below a certain level in business, and I mean like a very big level, maybe like 500 million, something like this, strategy understanding, it just vanishes. It just goes out of the window. I mean, it's hard enough for the top MBA consultancy type people to keep a handle on it, but when they've left the room, then there really is nothing left there. And you then see this with all the engagements that I have with clients. You see, my God, people that they do not know what this is. They don't know what they don't know. It's not even that they have the wrong understanding of it. It's more that there's just a sort of hole in their head where that thing might be. And part of the reason for this is because all of the existing strategy theory and literature, which by the way is, it's all excellent and correct, and I have absolutely no technical disagreements with it at all. But it's not interesting, and it's not accessible, it's not sexy, and no one's going to read those bloody textbooks when they're running a business. They're just going to fly by the seat of their pants. So I was like, okay, well, can I basically give a description of strategy which would help, the people who are really doing strategy are not strategists or strategy consultants. The people who are really doing strategy out there are founders and CEOs. So I was like, and they've got lots of other responsibilities other than reading about bloody strategy. So I was like, well, how can I give them like just enough key information so as that they get it and they can then make
Hmm.
decisions accordingly. So that's what I was trying to do with the book. Hence, no bullshit strategy. Try and get there as quickly and punchily and stickily as possible. And so, yeah, I do think that it has opened up the world of strategy to quite a lot of people.
I think so as well. I had to read a couple of strategy books during my time at university. And what I found quite interesting was that the examples they put out, whether it be Nokia, whether it be Apple or Microsoft or LVMH or Lockheed Martin, those are not the typical type of companies. Like if
Yeah, true.
you pick like 100 random companies out of a list, you won't pick companies like that. You pick like an e-commerce store selling aquarium tanks. You pick like
Yes,
a
true.
food truck business. You pick a barber shop. Those are the companies you pick, right? And to the owner of a barber shop, they probably wouldn't read a book like Blue Ocean Strategy, for example, right? And second, they wouldn't compare themselves to Apple.
No, I never think about this, but you've touched on a really important point. In fact, I'm going to actually make a note to myself about it because I don't want to forget it. Because everything that I write, I try to make it completely universal. Um, so the so that the yeah, there we go. I will remember that now. So that the chief executive of Halliburton and the teenage girl selling friendship bracelets in her bedroom, the principles apply to both. And there is a universality to business. Now, to your point, there are types of strategy and sort of strategic concepts which only apply to the chief executive of Halliburton or some multinational, multifunctional global corporation. There are certain bits of strategy which they have to think about, which a 100 million business, single brand business doesn't have to think about. So I don't really like talk about them. I only talk about the universal factors. And that is ultimately, I think, what makes it simple because just as you say, a lot of the strategy textbooks, they feel that they have to incorporate the fullest, widest, broadest, truest definition of strategy. But actually, that just makes it very hard to pass and hard to grab. You're better off being a little bit narrow and a little bit reductive and a little bit wrong if that's what it takes to actually get people to understand the core principles.
So what is a helpful definition of strategy? What would you
Right.
suggest instead?
Yeah. So if we think back to that friendship bracelet versus multinational corporation thing, if you want to understand, obviously a strategy in any walk of life, not just business, is, it's the means by which you are going to achieve some sort of goal, the means by which you are going to succeed or thrive. And so you could have a strategy for getting six-pack abs, or you could have a strategy for having a happy marriage or whatever. So there is this very broad universal definition of strategy, which kind of applies to everything. But we don't want that when we're talking about business. We want a tighter definition that is only applies to business, because that broad definition, it doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't point us in the direction to go. It doesn't give us a flavor of what a good strategy looks like. So if you want to come up with a definition of strategy for business in particular, you first have to understand what business is at its core, like what all businesses are. And when you think about it, the very definition of business, and not enough people do think about this, people never stop and think, what actually is a business? It's just a system which is designed to generate value and then exchange that value for other value, i.e., cash. So you've got a sort of machine, essentially, which puts value out there into the world and takes value back in. Now, when you understand that, it's then very clear to think, okay, well, how does a business grow? How does a business succeed? Well, it grows by giving more value. The more value you give, the more value you're going to receive. And now we have an idea, basically, of the purpose of strategy. Strategy is just your way, your methodology, essentially, of how you are going to maximize the value you're going to put out there. Now,
So it's a type of plan.
yeah, I mean, you get people, it gets very complicated and sort of controversial when people use, like, was it a plan, or is it a this, or is it a that? I mean, I'm perfectly happy with people saying that it's a plan. I would say that it's the identification of the value that you're going to put out into the world, plus the thing that you're going to do that is going to enable you to actually deliver that value. So, there is a sort of conceptual part of it and there's a doing part of it, and both of them come together. So, I think Roger Martin, for example, he says something along the lines of, oh, value is a strategy is a set of choices. And this is, of course, true, but he's talking about the executional side of the equation. But what is the guiding principle of those choices? Well, the guiding principle of those choices is your attempt to deliver value to the market, right? So it is a set of choices, but those choices need to be directed at something, and that thing is value. And if you look at businesses out there who don't have strategy, which is to say 99% of them, they all have exactly the same problem. The problem shows up in different ways and they interpret it as different things. But actually, if you were to be really brutal about it, businesses only have one problem. And that problem is that they do not give sufficient value into the world. And that's why they have trouble collecting money back. So, what do businesses who don't give sufficient value do? Well, they do all sorts of hacks and tricks and hustles to try and give the impression of value. So, for example, if you drop your prices in order to compete on cost, but dropping your prices is literally an attempt to raise the value that you're putting out there. If you spend a lot of money on marketing and like branding and advertising, that is a way to try and generate the perception of value. Everything that businesses without strategy do is an attempt to generate value where no value exists. But with a hypothetically perfectly strategic company that is just pouring an incredible amount of irresistible, unique value into the market. They can charge what they like. They barely need to do any marketing because people just want the thing that they're selling. So if you manage to achieve that, if you manage to put value out there, which number one, people want, but number two, they cannot get from anywhere else, then that business is going to make money automatically without any effort. And that is the game of strategy. That you are trying to achieve that nirvana of offering value to people that they're desperate for and no one else wants. And obviously, very very few businesses get there, but that's the target.
Yeah. So I was going through your material that you put out, which I really, really like. And one thing you said that crossed my mind now was that you want to try to end up in a space where you're not fighting over market share, where you're not competing. You want to be in your own uniqueness, so you're not getting compared, right? Did I
Yeah,
get
that's right.
you correct here? I was wondering because most companies do compete over market share, and most investors would argue that if a market is so interesting and has so high margins, you have to compete over it. And I was wondering how that fits into your suggestion of not competing.
So, in a hypothetical perfect world where every single business was completely strategic, every single business would be offering something that was so differentiated that there would be no such thing as competition, and the market would be like a sort of symbiotic ecosystem where everybody balances each other out and everyone earns tons of profit, and it's
Mhm.
kind of a sort of paradise. Now, of course, that isn't the situation, but that is the kind of thing that you want to be shooting for, whereby you, as you say, are offering something unique and people who want that thing can only come to you. Now, to me, this is by definition a non-competitive mindset, because competition is what happens when two businesses are selling the same thing. And then they have to fight over, okay, will the one customer choose us or will that customer choose them? Now, so this is the situation you want to avoid. Now, the funny thing is that about the market share piece is that, of course, sometimes, often, most of the time, you are going to be in a market where there are similar options. And so, therefore, you will have a certain amount of market share. And of course, in that situation, you think, well, naturally, we would want to get more market share. But ironically, even in those situations, you can operate in a non competitive way. And I'll give you the classic example of this. So there was a point in time when the iPhone had 15% market share, so it didn't have great market share. Samsung was much, much bigger. But the iPhone had 79% profit share. So 79 pennies of every dollar spent earned of profit earned in smartphones was earned by the iPhone, even though the iPhone only had 15% market share. Now, why did this happen? Well, because think about it. You think, okay, all of these brands are in the smartphone market, and therefore they are all competitors. But that is not true, because a competitor is defined by, or competitors are defined by um, customers making a choice between those two things. So the thing is that because the iPhone had built up such a degree of perceived differentiation, people who bought iPhone customers do not consider other options in the market. So nobody really goes into a store, or certainly at that time anyway, they didn't, and says, shall I get the HTC or shall I get the iPhone? That doesn't happen, right? So
Do you
those
do you
two
have
things,
an iPhone?
I do. So I've
Do you
never given one second of thought to another smartphone brand, right?
Me neither.
So there you go. So you cannot say the fact that they're in the same market is completely irrelevant. You cannot say that the iPhone and HTC or whatever are in competition. But are HTC and Samsung in competition? Yes, because there are people who say, shall I have that one or shall I have that one? So the result of this is that the iPhone existed in a non-competitive state within a competitive category. It sort of had a wall around it, right? Where there were some customers who were only for iPhone, and there were some customers who were only for everything else. And the customers who are for everything else, they have zero interest in the iPhone. That's the other important factor, right? Now, the reason that Apple earned those obscene profits is because they had this sort of wall between them in the category. They did not have to take all of the actions that brands who have to compete take, because all of the competitive actions you have to take lower your profit margins, whether it means spending more on marketing, whether it means fighting on price, whatever it might be. So hopefully I've a little bit inarticulate, but hopefully I've explained how even if you think, well, of course we're competitive and of course we have to fight for market share because we are in a competitive market. No, you can create a walled garden within that market where customers do not cross the wall. And if you achieve that, then your profit rates are just going to go boom. And who cares what your market share is if your profits are 5x what everyone else's are?
Absolutely. It goes a little bit contrarian to the capital side of things, where investors would go in and say, you have to grow by so and so, you have to return my money 10 times in the next couple of years, right? And then those companies have to venture out in that space you mentioned and try to acquire more space and get into other markets as well, right? So if let's say, do you know the car brand Lotus? Yeah. So Lotus was acquired by Geely, and when they were acquired by Geely, they switched from building very lightweight, very driver-oriented cars to the big electric SUV, like the thing that sells, right? And then suddenly they found themselves in a competition with BMW, maybe Tesla, Mercedes, right? So I think you're absolutely correct. And what's driving companies in such situations where they are competing is the outside forces that push them to grow, and
Yeah,
then they move in those spaces.
I mean, you've hit on an incredibly point that people rarely hit upon, and there's so many angles to it. But I guess the rough way that I would respond to it is that, as you said, there are certain forces in the market which actually pervert business, that make it operate in a sort of in a non-optimal manner, and capital is actually one of those forces. So we've all seen brands that basically get overcapitalized and then they blast into a market, and even though they're not very good, like Casper mattresses or something, they sort of ruin their market just because they've got so much money. So that market before was a sort of self-regulating organic market, and then a
Mhm.
brand like Casper comes in and just actually destroys the integrity of the market because they are sort of like they're bulldozing in a non-strategic brute force way through the market. Now, and I'm not saying that necessarily this is a bad idea on the part of Casper or Casper's investors, because there are different games at play, but like that is a game that you can only play if you've got stupid amounts of money, and so strategy is not really something that businesses who have got stupid amounts of money tend to worry too much about. So yes, you do. There is, in some senses, there is a tension between the interest of capital and the truth of strategy in some sense. So again, going back to my point about always being universal, um, like I'm talking about strategy from the point of view of a business that does not have any sort of like ridiculous fair advantages, like hundreds of millions of dollars of injected capital or something like that. I'm talking about like a flat level that any business can play. So so that's a very very interesting point you touched on there. And then the Lotus point, I think, is a secondary point, which is very interesting as well, which is that what is strategic is not necessarily the same as what grows the most, or what even necessarily earns the most money. If we go back to the Apple thing, Steve Jobs's Apple was 1,000 times more strategic than Tim Cook's Apple, but Tim Cook's Apple is much, much, much bigger and more valuable. So you might look at that and you might say, well, who's running the business the right way? Well, the thing that's happening there and the thing that's happening with Lotus is that sometimes you get a business that is built incredibly strategically, and then it builds up a tremendous amount of brand recognition, goodwill, and all sorts of like other intangible factors. And then once it has reached a sort of pinnacle of kind of strategic power, it will shift gears and it will start milking the position that it's created. And that milking process will actually erode the strategy. And the art, I suppose, and Ferrari is another brand that's doing this at the moment, I would suggest. And so that milking process, it's a delicate balancing act where they think, okay, how can we milk this the maximum we can without killing the business altogether? So, and there probably is a balance you can do this. So like Apple are doing it well. Like Apple are not what they used to be, but they also haven't destroyed their reputation, right? So they've done it pretty well. The milking. Lotus, it appears to me, are probably not doing the milking quite as well. Although I'm not 100% sure on like what's going on with them, but I mean, they're not working with quite the same amount of sort of brand capital that Apple was working with. But you see what I mean about how like you can take a strategic business and you can squeeze more growth out of it in a way that is fundamentally unstrategic. A good way to think about strategy in my mind is that the output of strategy is not necessarily growth or money. The output of strategy is health. So I know it's a weird thing to say, but like a very strategic business is a sort of healthy business, like a perfectly functioning, healthy body. And then you can push that business to higher rates of growth in a way that actually lowers the health of the body, in the same way as that, let's say you could, if you had to push yourself to lift as much weight as possible, you with steroids and overtraining and all the rest of it, you could do that, but you would not necessarily be at optimum health. You would just be pushing to maximize the weight that you can lift.
Yeah.
So it's a really weird analogy, but hopefully you get what I mean.
Yeah, I think I totally got what you meant. To me, strategy. So I was playing a trading card game called Magic the Gathering. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I've heard of
Yeah,
it.
so I was playing that like a fanatic when I was younger. I was playing that on an European level.
Wow.
Strategy, in that case, for me, strategy always meant the plan that brings you into a better state. So it brings you into a better market position if you want to put it in our business perspective. So it's pretty much the thing that puts you in your uniqueness, so to say, right? So with that card game, it was like you have a strategy in mind that puts you in place where you can easily spend resources or where you can easily play a lot of cards in a very short amount of time. It it was it enables you to be in a certain state and do certain things, not necessarily by scale, but entirely just to be there, and just being there is a competitive advantage that you wanted to have. And I
Yeah,
think it
and
was
it's
really interesting that
mm,
you mentioned Ferrari as an example. Did you know that Enzo Ferrari in his very early years, when they needed to, so Ferrari as we know it today is basically just existing because they needed to fund the Formula One racing cars and the development of those cars. And they did this by putting out street legal cars and selling those. And Enzo Ferrari always put like the worst engines or the worst suspension, or he was like I'm just doing this to get a little bit more money to build better Formula One cars. But I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
necessarily like giving away all the cool stuff to my clients. My clients are the people watching the racetrack, not the ones buying the cars.
that's cool. That's cool, isn't it? And there's
Also,
a,
like
I mean,
really neglecting all that part of that business.
yeah, and there's a purity in that, which the brand had for a long time, all the way, because obviously, like, by the time he died, they weren't making crap cars. The cars were very exciting, but they weren't like pouring all of their engineering efforts into the cars. There's a sort of purity to what you're saying, which, when the balance of power, let's say, within the organization shifted, and they started kind of like pushing the quality of the cars, they actually pushed I would say, as a fan, they pushed the quality of the cars too far, and then you actually lose the stuff, that the sort of romance that makes it special. I don't need a Ferrari to be the best all round, most perfectly
Yeah,
engineered car ever. I need it to be an expression of the spirit of the racing team, and I kind of don't care, like, all, like, how good the radio is or whatever. So it's yeah, I never thought about that angle, but I think there's an important additional point with your Magic the Gathering thing, which is that I do like your definition of strategy in that context, and that is what I would call the sort of the broad definition that goes beyond business and covers everything. So that is a definition of strategy which applies to strategy in every possible context. The difference with something like a game or a sport or a war, which is where business is different, is that a sport, or presumably this is the same with Magic the Gathering, it is designed to be a zero sum game, because you are trying to sort of kill the other team, you are trying to win. So the strategic approach is, it is aimed at, it is actually explicitly aimed at competition. So whilst in business the strategic approach is to avoid competition, in sport the strategic approach is to compete better. And people get very confused with this, because people sort of, they draw parallels between the two things, and they think, well, yeah, well, like, me and my company are a little bit like, like a sports team, and our competitor is a little bit like, the rival sports team. We're like Liverpool and Man United or whatever. And so then they sort of take inspiration from sport, and they try and sort of essentially kill the other guy. Um, and ironically, although what they're doing is a good move in sport, it's the opposite of a good move in business. So this really, really results in some really terrible decisions. So you really need to recognize that the two domains are far more different than we think they are.
yeah, I completely agree. When I was reading your book, I read through the section and you really caught me off guard with it because the way my brain is wired, it comes from that card game strategic perspective where I want to win over territory, competitors, market, right? So I was always thinking that, okay, so I have to like don't give away space in that market. If you can stop someone from having something nice, do it, even if it's not beneficiary to my business. So
Yes.
that was the way that my brain was wired, right? And I went through your book and I was like, yeah, this takes a lot of effort in not providing value. This is just taking a lot of my energy and consumes a lot of my energy by just putting someone else down, putting another company down. I'm not getting anything from them, right? If that client goes to that company, do I really lose something? Probably not, because they have a very different, unique value proposition than I do. And I really
Yeah.
you really caught me off guard with what you've written there.
Yeah, I mean, it is a it's not something that it's a funny one, because it's not something I sort of made up, in that if you read into other more sort of formal traditional strategy literature, you can find that same idea, but they come at it in a very different way, because that idea, the irony of it is that if you take the non-competitive approach that I advocate for, you do, of course, win in the end. It is still a sort of approach to winning. You are still going to end up with better results than the other guy, which is, of course, sort of what you wanted all along. So you could kind of like approach it from a competitive angle. And I think that is the way that traditional strategy talks about it. They talk about this as a kind of like another form of competition. But I actually think that's sort of confusing and misleading. And this is why like the symbiotic, collaborative, non-competitive approach it gets you to that idea much more quickly than thinking of it as a way of winning. So like, there is that famous strategy definition of like, something like strategy is choosing where to play and how to win or something. And
Yeah.
it's like, of course, this is true, but I think that the spirit of that statement takes people in the wrong direction, even though there's nothing
Mm.
technically wrong with it. So it's funny, so much of this stuff is about language and about the implicit subtext of the language that you are using. Um, and so this is the kind I focus much more with my work on the sort of the flavor and style of the language that I'm putting across than the substance. Because the substance has been said a million times before. I'm not innovating, right, in the field of strategy. All I'm trying to do is just say, all right, well, just forget that and just why don't you think about it like this? And then for some people, the light bulb goes on and they're like, I get it now. So yeah, it's a funny part of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Just it's if you think of it retrospectively and you look behind, then it sometimes seems so weird. Like, just imagine one of the first iPhones would be designed to compete with a Nokia phone. That wouldn't have made any sense. If Apple from the get-go tried to compete with Nokia, they wouldn't be where
Yeah,
they are.
yeah, exactly. Because they look at it and they think, well, Nokia have got 60% market share or whatever they had back in like
Yeah.
2005. And they think, well, that's what a good phone looks like. And so, how can we do what that phone does, but better? And you're not going to do that. But it was very clear that, like, I don't think that Steve Jobs wasted 1 second of thought on Nokia.
Yeah. I
But
think we see the
unfortunately for
same.
Nokia, they wasted a lot of thought on Steve Jobs.
Yeah, and I think we see the same with Tesla and the automobile industry, where Tesla is not giving anything about what Volkswagen is doing, but Volkswagen or Ford or any other car company is very much looking at Tesla and observing what they're doing and trying to copy things of it. And that puts them into a very weird space. I remember when there was a car manufacturer alliance, and there is Germany, that oh, in Europe, and they put out charging stations and they want to beat Tesla with it. They thought, well, Tesla's doing it, we have to do it as well. But they're just not. You're not going there. You're charging at a Tesla charging station if you have a Tesla, and if you have another car, you just charge wherever your car is conveniently charged, like what is on the road, right? You're not into that space that Tesla created. So I think
Yeah,
very much that history repeats itself from the Nokia iPhone perspective.
it definitely does. And Tesla, they don't have the same sort of like strategic power that they had in the past. There are times have moved on and maybe they've made some decisions that aren't like the optimal decisions or whatever, blah blah blah. But I think people do forget that like they do still have in the world of electric cars, they have some elements of extreme leverage over the other brands. It's quite easy now to look at it and be like, well, is there really any difference between like the Tesla Model 3 and this Volvo or whatever? And you sort of superficially think no, but they're still underrated, I think, in terms of their strategic position, albeit it isn't the insane level of glory that they had in the sort of 2007 to 2015 kind of period, which was like one of the great case studies of all time, arguably the
Yeah,
great case study.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also a very good example of what we covered earlier with the IPO of Tesla and now the valuation of the market valuation of Tesla as a company,
Yes.
which is pushing them to deliver certain numbers on their quarterly reports, which drives them to take measures they wouldn't have done if they wouldn't have IPO'd and wouldn't have to have that pressure on them on growing into their valuation, right?
Yes, very good point. Yeah, no, they are quite a good case study of the perversion of capital. Yeah, so to walk the tightrope between incredible strategy and then all of the other forces and pressures that are coming to bear on them, you can't expect somebody to like really totally nail that. It's always going to be a compromise.
Yeah. So we're slowly coming to an end of this episode. Um, Thank you very, very much for being here. If people want to learn more about strategy and the content you're putting out, where can they find you?
Well, I'm putting out stuff most days on LinkedIn. And of course, this is all designed to get you to, strategy understanding very quickly, very effortlessly. And then I have a newsletter as well, weekly newsletter, which is free. So you can get that at basicarts.org/newsletter.
You don't
But
have
then,
to write it down. Don't worry. Just click on the show notes, and there will be a link directly pointing you at book, LinkedIn, and the newsletter as well, which I can highly recommend. It's a really good newsletter. It's one of the few newsletter that I subscribe to that I'm not directly throwing into the bin.
that's all one can hope for with a newsletter, yes. But then, ultimately, obviously the newsletter I'm talking about, kind of like sort of ad hoc strategy topics each week. Clearly, if you want to get like the ground up, the fundamentals that then everything else sits on top of, that's what the book is for. 138 pages. Read them, and you'll basically know what you need to know. And you'll certainly know more than 99.9% of people, purely not because the book is so amazing, but because 99.9% of people know zero. So it's not very hard to improve on zero.
All right. Alex, thank you very much. Hope we can do a second episode about strategy.
Oh, thanks a lot. It's some really, really interesting discussion.
All right, then. Bye bye. Thank you all so much for bearing with us until the very end of today's episode. If you like this one, why not share it with someone who might like it as well? For you, it's just a click, but for me, it would really make my day. And if you came to this point thus disliking this episode, reach out. I'd really love to learn from you how I can improve your listening experience. Also, make sure to subscribe to the episode. Check out our extra content on LinkedIn, and for duck's sake, the website is finally online. Check out www.stellarwork.com. I'm posting new blog articles and case studies on a regular basis. Also, I pre-uploaded some new content, so there might be a couple of new articles waiting for you. All right, till then, bye.
Hey Alex, thanks for showing up today. Got your book in hand, can't put it away. Talk about strategy, you've got it all, from big CEOs to the guys in the mall. Value is key, it's not just a plan, it's the difference between the fail and the grand. Not about fighting, but standing alone in a space where your value is known. We're talking no bullshit, no games, no lies, just a clear-cut path to the skies. Strategize, elevate, make it unique in a world where success isn't bleak. Benjamin's been reading it back to forth. Natural transitions need more at the core. Execution's cool, but what's the strategy for? Alex breaks it down, opens up the door. It's more than just market, it's about the state of a business that's healthy, never late. Drop the prices, run the ads, but value something everyone grabs. We're talking no bullshit, no games, no lies, just a clear-cut path to the skies. Strategize, elevate, make it unique in a world where success isn't bleak. It's more than just market, it's about the state of a business that's healthy, never late. Drop the prices, run the ads, but value something everyone grabs. We're talking no bullshit, no games, no lies, just a clear-cut path to the skies. Strategize, elevate, make it unique in a world where success isn't bleak. Catch Alex on LinkedIn, knowledge free, newsletters lit, basicarts.org. See books that guide, strategies key, stellar work podcast, it's the place to be.